Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Hello and welcome back to Cultivate. I'm here with a special group of people today, and I use special in many senses. So I'm here with a group of people that's, in some senses, they're odd. And I'm going to tell you the first oddness of this group. The group is called the Alphabet Group. Now that doesn't sound odd, but no one in the group knows exactly how it got its name. That is kind of odd. So we're a group of people, and I want to introduce them to you one at a time. Dan Spanjer, who is the chairman of our Board of Governors. Thanks for stopping by, Dan.
Thank you, Ty.
Bruce Etter, the academic dean here at Veritas Academy.
Thanks, Ty. Good to be here.
And the co-host of Cultivate and our dean of students here, Graham Dennis. Hey, Graham.
Hi, Ty. Thanks for having us.
So today, one of the things that the Alphabet Group does is we get together and talk. Now, if you know Graham, Bruce, Dan, and I, that usually means that we're going to be off on tangents a lot during Alphabet Group meetings. And today, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay focused.
Is that a promise or a prophecy?
It's a promise.
It's a lie.
Just call it what it is.
Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is thinking critically about polarizing cultural conversations. Thankfully, there are none of those that are going on today. You know, everything's just peaceful and wonderful. We're going to start by just, there are different theories about getting into a pool, like dangling your foot in for a little while, or maybe like getting into the kiddie pool and then getting deeper and deeper. We're just going to jump into the deep end of the pool here on this one. So we're going to start by talking about CRT, critical race theory. So what is this? And I thought maybe, Dan, you'd be a good guy to just start to unpack what's going on in this controversial, polarizing idea of critical race theory.
And you said earlier when we started we had 7 hours for this conference. Is that correct?
7 hours.
7 hours. Good. I'll take up the first four gentlemen with this one, and then you can jump in. Yeah, that's a big question, Mr. Fischer, because critical race theory has a long heritage, part of critical theory and critical belief, which has been around for a while, but it's been picked up as a way of managing race issues and race controversies. And without getting too deep into it, I think we could say as a basic that in critical theory, you believe that it's the structures of society and the constructs, everything from economics and society and culture and language, even the sense of humor you used. All of these structures position people in society as either an oppressed person or an oppressor, as a victim or someone in control. And what it respects is not that it's an individual choice, but that it's a structural societal choice. And so critical race theory is one attempt to fix that, to fix the balance by re-altering the structure of society and its frameworks in order to give other people who've been oppressed by it a chance to actually flourish.
Well, and how do you do that alteration? Is it a lot of this seems to be kind of a rethinking or a reimagining or making a new narrative for the past?
Well, that's it, because if you think of all the things that construct the meaning in our society, everything from our institutions, the way we bank, the way we talk, or all of those things, they've come to us from a sense of history. You think you're American, you like liberty. All of these words tend to mean something, but they're really part of constructs in society. And those constructs are not actually liberty, they're ones that actually empower one group of people who agree with them or have crafted them and given them a place what we call privilege in those, and then people aren't. So it'd be like in a sense of starting a baseball. Let's say our entire society or culture was a baseball game. That's my preferred sport.
DH or no DH?
We're going to go no DH on this. I think pitchers ought to.
Amen.
Yeah,
Dennis.
pitchers
Amen
ought to hit. Go nationally. So, the whole culture is a baseball game. But you were really born to be a football player, and you play football or a golfer, and now you have to play baseball. The rules are set so that you will not succeed. And so if we want you to get along in society, we're going to have to break the rules of baseball so that we can allow other rules and constructs, fields, rules, equipment to prevail so that you get to be who you are. And so to be critical of those constructs so that you create space for people who are different, less privileged, victims, whatever the case may be. So it's always an activist mentality. You have to break what's there to recreate it.
So Graham and Bruce, why does our culture right now struggle to talk respectfully and cogently about this issue and others? Because, when we think about polarization, well, in our culture right now, we might be at the most polarized point since the Civil War. And really, if you think about the Civil War, there were severe disagreements, but everybody had a fairly consistent worldview, whether you're in the North or the South. The differences now are actually broader. So why do we struggle with this so much, to talk to each other?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's kind of where we have to begin. We're all men here, and we're all married. So I thought maybe an illustration from marriage may be helpful. Have you guys ever had a situation where you're communicating with your wife and something escalates very rapidly, and you're asking yourself, where did that come from?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
no. I call those situations my fault.
well, hey, we're headed in the same direction. Okay. And when you talk to your wife to try to figure out where did this explosion come from, what you usually find out, well, it's because I didn't listen when I should have been listening, and this thing.
What were you saying?
Right, exactly. We're good at it.
Yeah.
We're pros. I think this issue, to some degree, has to do with the fact that we haven't listened. We haven't heard what folks, what minorities have been thinking and feeling for decade after decade after decade. We've pushed it aside. I'm certainly not advocating for CRT here, but I do believe that part of the issue is the fact that we have not listened, and now we're looking around thinking, where did that come from? And we may have been able to deal with some of these things earlier, and maybe they wouldn't have escalated so much if we would have been better listeners early on. But I don't know. Graham, what do you think?
I'm going to take the opposite approach, Bruce. Got to have some controversy.
So
here.
That's why this is fun.
Right, no.
Academy's for.
And here comes the polarization.
Yeah. No. Actually, I think that this answer is going to be very much in line with what Bruce is saying, but I'm going to take a different angle. I think that one of the challenges you have in a culture that becomes increasingly pluralist, in other words, you don't have an obvious orientation or foundation for what a conversation is going to look like. What are the terms? Where is it going to go? What are we even talking about? And I think what starts to happen, there's a critical mass in a culture that has let's say pluralist viewpoint, like ours, that it's hard to have a conversation. I think there's just a practical problem that we face. Tocqueville talks about this. When do we reach the point of critical mass in which our conversations are so diverse? The starting points, the end points, the terms are so diverse. So I'm not disagreeing with Bruce. I guess I would use a slightly different metaphor. Round up 150 people, put them in a room, and tell them to talk. Round up 2,000 people, put them in a room, and tell them to talk. And as that number increases, it's harder and harder to have a meaningful conversation. So I think there's a critical mass of viewpoint diversity that we've reached culturally that makes it really hard for us to have enough common ground to have meaningful conversations.
Well, and of course, this issue has become a politically sensitive one. If you don't believe that, you can turn on any of the cable news, and I put news in scare quotes there, any of the cable news stations tonight, and if you sit there for about 5 minutes, you're probably going to hear something about critical race theory, either that it has infected every part of society or that it doesn't exist. So I was asked this summer, are we going to ban critical race theory at Veritas Academy? Now, and there have been states that have done this. What do you think the answer should be to that? Should we ban critical race theory? We're not even going to talk about it here at Veritas because it's either divisive or, and of course I have some deep disagreements with critical theory and critical race theory. But how should we as a Christian school, is banning the right thing, or should we move in some other direction? What do you guys think?
I want to jump in on that if I may, because I want to come back to what you gentlemen are saying, and I think this relates. That the critical theory addresses a reality. The reality is structures do in fact advantage some people over others. It's not, we don't reduce everything to that. There are other reasons why people think differently, but critical race theory is a reductionist belief that there is one reason why this has happened, right? That there's a constructs that were built by those in power, and now it's victimized a certain population. There's no sense in denying that. I think that's one of the things that Christians do wrong when it comes to critical race theory, is they don't, and to your point, Bruce, they don't hear that there are actual realities of people who suffer under structures and systems as they are. One of my friends who's an African American says you've never had to do the talk with your daughter. The talk is you don't drive after hours, you don't drive in these neighborhoods, you keep 2 hands on the wheel at all times. Have you ever had to have the talk? I said, no, my daughter's a white girl in a basically white town. But she said, I have to give that talk to my sons all the time. There's nothing wrong with saying that that's a reality for some people, to your point, Bruce. Question is, how do you theoretically frame it, right, to explain why it's happening, and then how do we address it? And I think critical theory takes a specific view on how to fix it. One of the things I've used to help explain to students with this is critical theory, like any theory, can do 2 things. One, it can tell you what's wrong, and then it can tell you how to fix it. And these are 2 very different parts. We can learn what's wrong, and maybe critical theory gives us some windows into things we didn't realize were wrong. The question is, does critical theory also have the formula to fix it? And there you have to ask other questions, because I'm not sure the formula for fixing it actually would fix most of the problems they claim or want to fix. So I think as a Christian school, to talk about the things that are actually wrong and to hear out a critical theorist is probably very wise. But I'm going to draw very careful lines when they say, and here's how you ought to do what you ought to do about it. I'll probably draw a line there and go, I'm going to have to filter that very carefully.
Well, and before we dive into the question, we are actually going to get to your question, Mr. Fischer.
No.
But I want to go back to that, and I remember something that Dr. Spanjer, I've heard Dr. Spanjer say to our students concerning senior thesis, that if you can't fathom, if you can't formulate why someone would hold the view you're opposing, pick another topic. You are heading down a dangerous path. So it's got to start there. I think that's great advice, and I think that has a little bit to do with if we can't fathom why people would embrace critical race theory, then I don't think we're going to make much progress in dealing with it. But now we should probably get to
Well, and so what that brings us to is really at classical Christian schools, we should be examining things and not just banning them. But as we do that, as we try to encourage people to examine ideas that we might not agree with, what should be the ground rules for debate and discussion? What should that look like in a Christian environment?
I'll just briefly say something that we do in our papers, and we start in our classical discourse for our 10th graders and try to do both in junior and senior thesis. First of all, we presuppose somebody's going to defend the position. You might play devil's advocate. You might make sure that the student has what we call a refutation, is taking seriously an opponent's objection to your thesis, stating it clearly, not creating a straw man and a kind of a caricature of the position, but actually taking that question seriously, or as Bruce said, taking seriously the viewpoint that your opponent might hold, being able to articulate that position, and then, in essence, being able to imagine yourself arguing for that position, and then the possibility for conversation or debate begins when you can understand your opponent's position. You might think your opponent's position is false, you might think it's ridiculous, you might think it's illogical, but you have to start with the understanding before you arrive at the judgment of your opponent's position. So the notion that understanding precedes judgment, I think, is important. So, step one is we have to arrive at an understanding of what our opponent's position is, and not, create a caricature of it or try to make it, belittle it, or.
Yeah, so basically that would end all cable news, I think, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean,
that's what we would
More's the
ban.
pity, huh?
yeah, but it's so often, when we see people trying to talk about ideas like this in our culture, it just breaks down to shouting and yelling at each other. Or even worse than that, maybe canceling each other, which that's a very harmful thing, because once you start to do that, all discussion ices over.
Yeah.
No one wants to say anything critical or to learn when they know they're not in an environment where they can't speak freely.
No, that's true, and it's amazing to watch what's happened intellectually in the West over the 20th century, and that is, I say that the original sin of human thought is reductionism. Right? Rarely rarely, Marx wasn't wrong about the disaster of industrialization in London. He was right about that, but he reduced the entire human experience to what he called mode of production, or the economic relationships. And I think what happens is once you reduce it down, you do this thing, and you guys remember George Lakoff, who was writing about moral politics back in the 80s and 90s, and what he realized is if you can reduce it to a polarity, or right or wrong, as soon as, if it's too complex, it's practical. I'll give you an example. They say, which is better, fuel injection or carburation? Well, that's a practical argument. It's a complicated thing. One's better, one's worse. Okay, but once you
What's
say,
the price of gas in this example?
$18 a gallon.
Oh, no.
Be there next month. But in that, you've got a very complex scenario, and you can choose one is percentagely better or worse. But once you reduce it to this is always right, then you've moralized the topic. And now either you're a villain or a hero. And the interesting thing about that modality in discourse is once you become a villain, there's no sense talking to you. There's no sense compromising with you. There's no sense listening to you. You do what you do with all villains. You defeat them.
Yeah, but you don't negotiate with orcs.
That's right. Exactly.
So back to critical theory, critical race theory for a moment, Dan. And I think that and this is going to transition into some of the things we do here at Veritas, but it seems to me, I was reading an article in First Things by McClay. He's a professor at Hillsdale, and he was writing about memory and how memory is at the root of so many of the issues. He was pointing out that if you get to a place in a civilization where there is no memory, then basically, instead of really talking about the facts, what actually happened in history, what history becomes is just a story told by some people that oppresses others. And what you're trying to do then is just get people to believe in another story that advantages your group and disadvantages another group. But he said, what we have to do, we can't have love, we can't have a civilization, we can't have covenant with God without memory. So in some ways, you talked about such obvious wrongs that have happened on racial bases in our society, which, having lived for a while in Jackson, Mississippi, they're just kind of sitting there. But this other part of it, when sometimes when I'm listening to an advocate of critical race theory, what I'm hearing is not really about legitimate issues. I'm hearing about, it seems to me that what they're saying is, I'm going to tell a different story. So how do we react to that?
I think that, again, I would use the word reductionistic because I think they tie it all into a piece. They'd say, something along the lines of the social outcome, let's say, of African Americans making less money per hour on average than, let's say, their white counterparts, they would say is the consequence of a long structural system that begins with slavery. So maybe they're not talking about slavery as the cause of it, but it's all of a piece of the structural sort of oppression that happens. And I don't know if this is right, and you guys can toss in and see if this is at all helpful, but I think one of the other parts of critical theory that's a constant is the idea of an evolutionary framework, that it's a constantly evolving and improving thing. And so in evolution, history is meaningless or useless. It's what's happening now and what's evolving into whatever it's becoming is the reality, and the past is merely a tool for that evolutionary process. So you don't need the past. In fact, what you're trying to do is evolve past the past, if you will. And I think evolution always, in the Marxian Hegelian frame, always plays sort of a backbone of critical theory, which is why the past is now fluid. And I think you're right, absolutely right, Ty. I mean, the idea of retelling a story is a central part of sort of the postmodern or critical matrix.
Yeah.
You mind if I go back to the ground rules, Ty?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, Bruce.
Well, I didn't think we fleshed that out a whole lot. I was thinking of two examples here that might be good. I think we would all agree here at the table that the greatest novel of all time is The Brothers Karamazov, written by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Obviously, at least this side of the table knows that.
Anna Karenina, is that what you said?
I knew that.
I wasn't listening to you.
I knew. Ty, put your copy of Tolstoy away. We're trying to do a podcast here, man. And one thing that strikes me about that novel, early in the novel, of course, there's the brothers all sort of represent these archetypal worldviews, and Ivan is the atheist, and he's wrestling with atheism. Early in the story, he encounters this godly elder, Zosima, and I think it might be the first time they meet, the first time they talk. And Zosima is interacting now with this guy who's saying he's really wrestling with the fact that there could be a world like this with evil and suffering, and so Ivan is wrestling with atheism. What Zosima does is not to get the apologetics bazooka out. He actually just kind of gets down on his level and says, this must be really hard for you to wrestle with this. This must be really painful. And he comes down his level and sort of there's this empathy and this care. And then later on, of course, he's built the rapport to really minister to Ivan. The other example I was thinking of, are you guys familiar, of course, with the great 20th and 21st century apologist Josh McDowell?
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if you're familiar with his son, who is a professor out at Biola University, a guy named Sean McDowell. Well, I encourage our listeners to check out some YouTube clips of Sean McDowell. I think that his paradigm, his model for how he deals with people who disagree with him is about as close to ideal as you can get. He invites people in, he hears them out, he hears their story, he listens to them. He does probably more listening than he does talking. But he challenges them and he pushes them and he disagrees with them in very respectful ways. So anyway, check out Sean McDowell. Those two examples came to my mind when I was thinking about ground rules. I think if we don't spend some time on the level of, again, why would someone believe this?
Because we kind of, if we don't, we lose the sense that this person is made in God's image.
Amen.
Isn't that the ethos part of it, Graham, as our rhetoric?
Yeah, I was going to say, too, just a quick interjection that, critical race theory is based on a truth, and the truth is that there's something terrible about injustice and what injustice does to the human soul, the way it disfigures the human soul for creatures created in God's image. So the real challenge is a lot of this is about identity, and this is an incredible opportunity to open up identity questions. It's, if you view these things as opportunities, if you're not hunkered down, but you realize our culture is screaming, is crying out for a way to answer identity questions. And as Bruce is saying, if we approach these things as opportunities, it's quite amazing if you listen carefully how much pain, hurt, but also uncertainty there is in our culture regarding identity questions.
Yeah, and that's why. So to segue, that's why we do this crazy thing here at Veritas, and that is not with all of our students, but with our oldest students, our 11th and 12th graders. We're inviting people in to argue for things that are in opposition to our school's statement of faith. Not just things like critical race theory, but all kinds of ideas that might be culturally popular and powerful, but don't fit with our school's statement of faith. So I just, when I think about doing that, there's like just a happy feeling that comes over me. Can any of you guys explain why I have that happy feeling? Is it something wrong with me, or and if you're a parent, when you hear that your school is inviting in an atheist or some believer in some theory that's not consistent with the Christian faith, why shouldn't you just get angry at your school?
Well, Ty, I don't know if you want us really to address that second question of whether or not there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
I won't get to that. But, as academic dean, I want to address this. The reality is our students are going to encounter these things when they leave here. So we can either bury our heads in the sand, we can either pretend like they don't exist, or I think maybe even worse, set up a straw man and beat the tarnation out of these worldviews and not really give them any kind of...
It's like MMA.
Right? It's like, and then send them off into the world and they find out, oh, well, you know what? My roommate believes this stuff that my omnibus teacher told me was evil, and my roommate's kind of a nice person. Yeah. So maybe all that was wrong. But what we're doing here is engaging these worldviews in an environment where we can then talk through what we believe as Christians and talk through what we believe the Bible has to say about these things, and hopefully prepare them to engage those ideas at the university.
Can I add something? Can I add something to that?
Yeah,
I want
please do.
I want to add, because I think you're right, Bruce. And the one of the reasons why I get that happy feeling, and I don't know if this is why you get that happy feeling, is that I think we have the courage to believe our worldview is true, and not overly. Not concerned that someone would come in and say, "Well, I think Christianity is all washed up for this reason." That's not something that causes fear. That's actually fine that you can say that, because we still believe what we believe is true. And I think for our students to see that we're not afraid to engage these things in a real way, in a winsome way, in a thoughtful way, really shows that I think we believe in what we believe in.
So, Dan, I think that I have that good feeling for the same reason that you have that good feeling. But what you pointed out, Bruce, is that our students, we describe Veritas, in my family, we describe it as a bubble. Now, I used to be kind of like, I didn't like that we were a bubble. And then I thought about the things that are outside the bubble, and I thought, pretty good thing to build a bubble sometimes, because I feel like, when we interact with students, especially students that might head out from Veritas to liberal schools or liberal colleges or places where, secularism has really gone to seed, those are not places of great debate and discussion. They're places where everything it's frozen over, basically. So what advice should we give to students that are headed off to college, and they might even find that the view of Christianity that they've grown up with, and that really has existed for most of the history of Western civilization anyway, which is that Christianity is a positive force in the world, that many of the places that we call colleges and universities, Christianity is a negative there. Aaron Wren's recent article about the three worlds of evangelicalism goes into the fact that around the time the Obergefell decision was made, many people started looking at Christianity not as a positive force in the world, but as a very negative force. Mm-hmm. So what advice should we give to these students that we're training and then sending out?
We had one of our speakers speaking to our seniors at graduation talk about the importance of courage. And I think it's a really great starting point is to know yourself, to know your weaknesses, and to know that oftentimes one of the reasons why we don't want to defend the truth publicly in a context like, as you're saying, Ty, we might be sending students to schools in which Christianity is going to be the minority position, or Christian, conservative theological Christian orientation is going to be the minority position. We have to make our students aware that courage is going to be required of them. And if my son or daughter knows that it's not easy to stand up for the truth, and it's something you're going to have to learn. It's going to be a virtue question. It's going to be a character question. It's going to be a failure question. It's going to be a get down on your knees and pray. It's going to require discipleship. It's going to require friendship. It's going to require, more wiser people around you. So I think just first of all, our students understanding the challenge that they face and having an accurate viewpoint about how challenging it will be.
Well, and it really is important as well that they are able to have some bubble time when they're in college. And what I mean is that they find a group of believers, and I would just say it's great to have, college groups and things like that, of Bible study, kids having Bible study at college and stuff. But the church is a multi-generational group of people, and I think that part of being able to stand up in a society that's bent against you is knowing that there's going to be time when you're going to sit down in a room and worship with people that do agree with you. Any other advice?
Yeah, I want to go on that. I've said this to many students who've gone on to grad school, some of them very harsh secular environments. And I have one right now, he's at University of Boston, and I send him a text, have done it for a while, every month, and say, have you found a church yet? Have you found a church yet? And I would say to students, you're going to doubt. You're going to see things you've never seen before. We can't cover everything at Veritas. You're going to hear facts and stories, and your empathy is going to be tweaked in ways it never has been before. Whatever you do during those seasons of heavy doubt, which are normal, don't leave the church. because doubt is normal, but at that stage you don't have the wisdom yet to know. And that's one thing that I think critical theory plays on, however it's done, is it plays on a lack of wisdom, it plays on overreaction, it plays on a heightened sense of empathy, which draws you into a certain space, right, where you feel like for the first time you're actually caring for people. But you haven't looked at how those theories actually work in the long run. I mean, the groups that have cried justice the most in history have been the most deadly regimes in the history of the world. And it's very easy to forget that when you're hearing about, incarceration rates for African Americans and then saying this is all because, and you get a rather simplistic moralistic theory as to why. And that empathy drags you into this judgmentalism that makes so much sense. And as you go back to the church and you reframe again, it gives you a chance to go through your doubts and find wisdom and maturity in time, rather than sort of becoming reactionary. So I would say, I want to go back to what you said, I think that is the number one most important thing to do.
Well, I want to go ahead, Bruce.
I'll just add advice for our college students. I would say be a listener. And for our hardcore gung-ho audience out there who are thinking, first of all, that's just what? That sounds so passive. So let's consider the question, what's the end goal? The end goal is to engage folks in the culture. How are you going to get people to engage is you got to start by listening to them. You got to hear them out. And you can bring out the bazooka later, but you can't start with the bazooka. I think you have to listen. You have to hear people out, and then I think you'll arrive at, or some people use the term, earn opportunities to share the truth in the most powerful and confrontational ways.
Wow. So we've talked a little bit about critical race theory today. And as Dan said, looking at the history of race in America, there are some positive things. There are some pretty dark chapters as well. So there actually is stuff sitting there that speaks real injustices. Like I always like to go back to King's I Have a Dream speech, where he says that in the Declaration of Independence, where we said all men are created equal, that what we did was we wrote African Americans a bad check, a bad check that had insufficient funds. So some people can be equal, but not everybody. Which is, it seems to me, when these people are coming out of the Jim Crow South, fairly obviously true at that point, right? But how can we but critical theory isn't really pointing us in a direction that's going to lead to real racial reconciliation. So how can we as Christians be involved in racial reconciliation in our churches and communities? Any wisdom to share on that?
Yeah, I'm going to tie into what Bruce said, because I found in my own experience with folk is that listening does not confirm someone else's bias, right? I think we always get in the idea, if I'm going to listen to you and I'm not going to resist you at some point, then I'm actually just confirming what you believe. And I think we have to realize that people going through these things are also going through struggles and suffering. And maybe they found a way to frame their suffering with critical theory, and maybe that's helped them. But maybe they're trying to search, and maybe they're trying to find also. And just because you hear someone out and you hear how they deal with it doesn't mean you're actually confirming their approach to it. Just means you're actually giving them a chance. And I had one person say this not too long ago to me about evangelism, and saying the best way to evangelize is not to hit people over the head with your beautifully, crafted King James or ESV, depending on what you're reading Bible. But it comes to this idea of just be open about the fact that you love God and obey Him. And that if you turn your volume up, if you just act in a way that's consistent and don't worry about offense, you'll find that people will know that you're someone they can talk to. And opportunity, I think maybe Bruce, this is where you're going, opportunity when it comes, then we'll provide you those spaces. But I think you're right. I think we have to actually be able to willing to hear people out and speak honestly about what we believe.
I think, first of all, maybe just acknowledging a mess that took decades, if not really centuries, to create isn't going to be undone with some sort of racial reconciliation statement that a denomination puts out. That we need to be thinking a little bit more in terms of the long haul. Like, what are we aiming for in 10 years or 40 or 100?
Yeah, one thing real quickly is I do think one challenge that we face when we look at the problem of racial reconciliation and we forget that There are other even more basic kinds of reconciliation that we're terrible at. I'm an elder in a church, and I know that just, reconciliation between two people who are basically share the same values, believe the same things, eat at each one another's houses, can be really challenging. So it really does start with the wickedness of our own hearts and the challenges that we face even in our normal relationships. If we could recognize how much more is required of us if we're already starting kind of in a position of poverty, if we're starting in a position of we have a history of struggling with this, we struggle with it even in our most basic relationships, how much more difficult. So as Bruce is saying, recognizing how incredible the challenge is, but the challenge starts because of our own sinfulness and our own inability to even reconcile sometimes within our own churches.
Yeah, and isn't it down at the root of it that we as Christians have to, there's, in our culture today, there's so much talk about identity. And really, this is this issue is front and center in the New Testament, not in the American context, but in an even greater racial divide between Jew and Gentile, right? Where you can't even sit at the same table and have a meal. You can't enter this person's house. So, but what happened was Christians found their identity in Christ. And they found their identity in Christ first in a way that said, that person over there who is maybe from a different country or has a different skin tone or that is different in so many ways is more like me than the person that looks just like me but isn't in Christ. So I think the beginning of real reconciliation is by Christ becoming a bigger and bigger part of our identity.
Yeah, there's that, Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this idea in Life Together that our solidarity as sinners binds us together in a profound way. And of course, the hallmark Christian virtue that's the opposite of Satan's sin is humility. And so when I recognize the challenge I have in my own heart, even with the neighbor with whom I get along quite well, or my own children, or my wife, reconciliation is based on a more fundamental brokenness. But we all share in that brokenness. That's our starting point, is the way that sin has broken our relationships.
Well, guys, thank you. Thank you for coming in today, and thank you for joining me in this conversation about how to talk about polarizing issues in society. So thank you, guys.
Ty.
Thanks, Ty.
Thanks, Ty.
So if you enjoyed the conversation today, please subscribe to the Cultivate podcast, share it with your friends so that other parents can benefit from these conversations and enjoy them with us.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.